So I'm joining you from a cabin in the Applegate, which is a little valley right along the California-Oregon border on the Oregon side of the Siskiyou Mountain Range. And this valley was called the Spink by the native folks who were here, the Tacoma people, and that meant Valley of the Beaver. My background, I am a wildlife biologist. I spent almost a decade running a restoration program, really focused around fish habitat and salmon habitat. And we did a lot of the stuff that folks do when they're looking at trying to increase fish habitat. We drug lots of logs into streams to try to create habitat. We called that large woody debris. We went and found dams and that had been abandoned, and we took those out with the landowner's help. We took blackberries and ground them up and planted plants in their place. And really the goal with a lot of what we were doing was to try to build habitat. There was this knowledge that the habitat is missing from salmon recovery. And so, well, let's go build it. And the thinking at the time was, well, you go find healthy habitat and you measure things and you look at, what's the density of hardwoods to softwoods and how many pools and how many large woody debris jams, and then you go construct that somewhere else. And there's really been a bit of a reckoning with that approach over the last decade, where folks have realized that it's not really working. And that habitat that we were constructing, while it looked really great once we were done constructing it, would then fall apart. And that's what I was seeing on my projects. That's what others were seeing. I would chat with people in this business. We're spending millions of dollars of grant funding to restore habitat, and everyone's like, yeah, it's not working. But don't say that too loud. This is a livelihood. So in the meantime, I noticed what our neighbors, the beavers, were doing because my restoration projects couldn't hold a candle to what beavers were creating across the landscape. This is a wetland near where I live. It's 7 acres of the most functional wetland you can hand me $500,000 and a bunch of diesel burning equipment, and there's no way that I can build this. This was a piece of property that had absentee landowners for 20 years, and the beaver cut a bunch of holes in a dike that had been holding the creek back from its historic area to create a cattle pasture, and they let the water back in and created this. And so I really started to approach restoration from that lens of, okay, well, in the degraded system, what can I do? What can my restoration action be to then facilitate beavers moving in, and a cascade of benefits that beavers would create on the site. So this is kind of in that general theme that you'll see a movement toward process-based restoration, where people are really thinking about, okay, so habitat is the product of process. It's the habits of nature, if you will, create habitat. And so how do we restore that process rather than just constructing something that looks like habitat? And beavers are a process. They're a natural process that has been managing the waterways of the Northern Hemisphere for thousands of years. So beavers themselves, let's talk a little bit about beavers themselves. So we all kind of have a baseline understanding of the animals, and then we can kind of get into how to engage with them. They seem to mate for life, and they're very territorial. They eat plants. They'll eat the bark off of trees, the cambium layer off of trees. They'll also eat herbaceous, but they, despite what Narnia says, they don't eat fish. And they are pretty famous for their number of structures that they create. So a well-known one is their lodge. They're mammals and semi-aquatic mammals, but they have to breathe air, right? So they'll construct themselves a den out of the wet landscape they've created, and this will have an underwater entrance and then a little air pocket, and they construct this out of mud and sticks. And the other structure that they build, folks will be familiar with, is of course the dam. And the dam is beavers aren't living in the dam. The dam is there to back up water across the landscape. Often they'll the dam itself will then set that water level that then keeps the entrance of their den underwater, because this is what's keeping predators from coming into their space. So here you can see a dam in the foreground or in the background, and then I'm standing more or less on their bank den. And if you are crazy like me and you crawl up inside of one of these things, this is kind of what it looks like in the interior. Is a little hollowed out space, pretty cozy, probably 4 or 6 feet. Lots of willow, and in this case, reed canary grass, making a little bit of a nest. And they're doing all of this. They're flooding landscapes, and the way that they do, really to avoid predation. They are a favored prey species by all the big predators. Cougars and bears and wolves were a big predator for them. And of course, people are now the #1 predator. Some of the other things you'll see, they're very habit oriented, and so they like to move their vegetation back and forth in the same place. So they'll develop these really distinct pathways, and then eventually, if they really like that spot, they'll dig it down into a canal, and they'll have these canals branching out across the landscape where they're moving vegetation back and forth. And that's one of the things that's harder for us as humans to see, but really drives a system. Beavers are moving literally tons of vegetation out of the adjacent forest and into the aquatic, into the water. And that drives the whole bottom of the food web. You've got all this then plant biomass in the aquatic system that then the aquatic bugs are eating, and then the fish are eating, and it's like that base level. So they're driving up nutrient pump by kind of harvesting the plants on the sides of the creeks and moving those into the creeks and bringing the creeks up and spreading them out. A lot of folks are familiar with the beaver sticks. They'll eat the cambium. They kind of twirl it like a corn cob, and they'll often have a little favored spot that they'll eat. So you'll find little collections of these floating around. I met a biologist who called these river reefs, because you snorkel up to one of these and there's so many fish eyeballs looking back at you. It looks like you just snorkeled up to a reef. These become these aggregated kind of structures that are just teeming with life and the freshwater systems. And so to kind of wrap it all up, we can return to this picture. You see the dam. This is on Spawn Creek outside of Logan, Utah. It's a very steep creek. Usually we think about beavers and shallow or low gradient systems. But in this case, there's an aspen grove that they've been harvesting aspen from for probably thousands of years. And they've got a dam. They've got their little food cache there in the pond. You can see all the kind of freshly cut sticks. And then in the background, you can see that big lodge. And then their trails are heading up into the aspen grove. And if we look at this system, if we look at this thing that beavers do with water on the landscape, we can, it's a lot. We can measure things and we can say, okay, well, the science backs up claims like, beaver wetlands increase waterfowl populations or increase fish populations or nesting for birds, etc. The reality of it is, though, that beavers have been managing the hydrology of the Northern Hemisphere for thousands of years. And so everything else that requires freshwater systems in their life cycle got used to beaver as the managers of that water, right? And so there's this fellow, David Thompson, who came through lower North America in the late 1700s, and he penned this thing in his journal that I think is good context for us to remember. I can read it out loud to you. So in 1794, he wrote of present-day North America, "It may be said to have been in possession of two distinct races of beings, man and beaver. Except for the Great Lakes, the waves of which were too turbulent, beaver occupied all the waters of the northern part of the continent. Every river where the current was moderate or sufficiently deep, the banks at the water's edge were occupied by their houses. To every small lake and all the ponds, they built dams and enlarged them and deepened them to the height of those dams. Even to the grounds that occasionally overflowed. These are our ephemeral streams, right? By heavy rains, they also made dams, and they made them permanent ponds. And as they heightened the dams and increased the extent and added to the depth of water. Thus, all the lowlands were in possession of beaver and all the hollows of the higher grounds. And that's a very interesting picture given the context we live in right now. There's this concept of shifting baselines. Like my baseline is different than that of my daughter, than that of my mother. This is the baseline that he was observing in the 1700s. And it's consistent with what I hear when I talk to folks who are indigenous to this area, where they describe beavers were wielding water, an element to manifest habitat down in the lowlands, while humans were wielding fire in the uplands to make habitat as well, right? So you kind of had these two ecosystem engineers, these two keystone species wielding their separate elements on the landscape, but doing so consistently for thousands of years, such that everything else got used to that. And you read the old trapper journals, they talk about getting into valleys and then spending all day trying to find a way to get across, because the flat area was the wetland. And so they look for beaver dams that were so old that they could walk a horse across. But that's hard for us to sometimes remember, because settlers very quickly drained these wetlands, moved creeks to one side or the other. We created creeks that looked like rivers, but those are pretty artificial construction. The flat areas of land were often wetlands, and that's where all the fertility came from, thousands of years of sediment. If you look at a lot of the old trapper maps, you'll see this, where waterways are often depicted as little necklaces of beaver ponds. And so you can see this one, each one, they numbered these beaver ponds, so you could keep track of like where you were at on the landscape based on this necklace of beaver ponds. And this is an example from my local area where beavers have fully reconnected the flat. You can see kind of then it facilitates this edge with the snags, where then of course you've got the woodpeckers and the bats and everything else. This really represents water security on a landscape that is seeing diminished snowpack in a meaningful way. So a little bit of historical context. Through most of the North America, beavers were trapped out kind of in this huge wave. I'm sure many will be familiar with it. That classic Abe Lincoln hat was made out of beaver felt. Beaver felt is really quite amazing, and these were really cozy hats, and it drove westward expansion through our continent. These tokens, MBs, made beaver, stood for a beaver hide that had been fleshed, salted, and dried. And so it was literally the first currency of the land. Instead of a gold standard, you can imagine a beaver standard, right? Where the first tokens were backed up by how many beaver pelts they represented. And this was the first European fellow that came through my area, the Applegate. Peterskin, Ogden. There's many places in the Western US that are now named after him. He was a pretty mean fellow, kind of looked like a frog. He lived up in the Seattle area, he's French fur trappers, and he killed 2 native folks up there, and he was looking to skip trial. And so the company, the Hudson Bay Company, was like, all right, we'll take care of you. We'll send you out of town on an expedition. So they sent him on the Snake River expeditions, and his orders were to create a fur desert and basically wipe out all the beavers from the coast to the Snake River. And this was because the American trappers were coming up from California, and the French up in present day Washington state and British Columbia didn't want the Americans incurring on their territory. And so they thought, well, if we create a fur desert, the Americans are going to get up there, they're going to see nothing for us here and turn around and go home. And he penned this in his journal when he was in the area that I now live. He was referring to the folks who lived here, and he said, they were going to skirmish at the time. May they destroy each other, the more the better. If they are fond of war, let them enjoy it, and we in the meantime will endeavor to wage war on their beaver. And that really was what it was. It was a war on the beaver. And it was before the gold rush, it was before the timber rush. There was this rush to extract all the beaver off of the landscape. Europe, of course, fared no better just thousands of years earlier. So beaver managed hydrology across the entirety of the northern hemisphere, and part of why the European colonials were so good at draining wetlands is they had a lot of practice in Europe. Also, beaver have two glands where they build up salicylic acid from willow, which is of course very similar to present day aspirin. So it was a big medicinal. One gland was worth about a year's wages for a medieval laborer, and beaver have two. So that was a lot of incentive to kill beaver. It didn't help to the Catholic Church at one point decreed that beavers were a fish because they were in the water and had scales on their tail, thus making it possible for those folks who were observing Catholic holidays that couldn't eat red meat. This was like the red meat you were allowed to eat because beavers were a fish. So say the church. So then there was a huge market for during the Catholic holidays. The rich would pay a lot for a beaver. This is, of course, the famed Beaver Bales. These are bales of beaver hides being moved out of present-day North America. And they were really seen as a natural resource to be extracted off the landscape. And it's that probably ended late 1800s, early 1900s. And beaver then kind of got degraded to a pest species. They do this a lot. When confronted with things that people build. You build a culvert in a road. First, the road is like a perfectly good dam across what would otherwise be, potentially a flat wetland, valley bottom. And then you leave one hole in it, and the beavers come and they're like, well, the humans did pretty well, but they left one hole, so we'll plug that and then, flood the rest of the valley. And we often feel pretty strongly about that. So we can get into that too if folks are interested. I spend a lot of my time helping folks with coexistence around beaver, but beaver have really been then delegated as a pest, really. And then more recently, there's been a lot of focus on beaver wetlands again, a lot of folks pointing at beaver dams, and a lot of interest in seeing beavers again as a natural resource, but this time instead of to be extracted, one to be retained on the landscape and encouraged. And it's because a lot of our systems now look like this. This is a high mountain meadow in my area. Used to be a functional beaver wetland. It was a really important place for First Peoples. There was a huge camas meadow here. Has 100 years of overgrazing now, and this is what the creek looks like. But beavers promise a lot to systems like this if they can get if their dam's going again. This is a dam that's been in place for 1 year on a similar system, and you can see all that red, the blush of willows starting to come back into the floodplain as that water settles behind the Beaver Dam, recharges into the adjacent floodplain, and starts reconnecting the hydrology that's been lost there. This is a picture I took in Eastern Oregon when you can see what it looks like then once it gets kind of up to the surface. You have these necklaces again of beaver ponds, and this is where all the wildlife is all summer long. Here's a little schematic of the idea. So this idea of process-based restoration and this idea of introducing beaver, it's playing with sediment recruitment and trying to kind of catch the sediment so that you can pack that wound back up and out of the landscape, and the water table will then follow and recreate that sponge. Because especially as we're seeing diminished snowpacks, this could be a really important thing for more water late in the summer. There's lots of other things you can point to too. I remember in the 2019 Global Earth Repair Conference, Tom Giroux was saying that wetlands he thought of them as one of the two best ways to sequester carbon terrestrially, right? So you've got carbon sequestration, you've got water quality, beaver dams are filtering water. And there's been a lot of focus recently on wildfire too. This is a picture that my colleague took last year with a drone, showing the change in wildfire behavior around a beaver wetland. This one's a beautiful image, but there's some that really show that none of the trees even burned, so the change in wildfire behavior, the change and severity is really pronounced around beaver wetlands. And that's been a focus recently too, is to start seeing, hey, these corridors could start acting like little fire breaks through our communities. So lots of folks are getting together and having these conversations, people from different sides of the political aisle, and spend their time doing different things every day, but really focused on water. So I guess the last little piece I want to kind of walk through with, and we can chat, is if you're looking to work with beavers on the landscape, what's the approach? What I would suggest is first to understand the context. This is a step that we often forget. We want to go do stuff. It's exciting to go work with beavers, let's move some beavers around or etc. But understanding the context when it comes to the landscape, when it comes to the beavers, and when it comes to the people. And I'll give examples of each of these. And then to take action following that, I would suggest an iterative approach where we're first working to help beavers stay, then help beavers fix it in degraded systems, and finally help beavers find it, moving beavers to those areas where they can't repopulate by themselves. So here's an example of a nerdy thing that you can do as a biologist, where you look at the intrinsic potential for beavers on a landscape. You can map things. So back to that understanding context. The blue lines represent places that would be really excellent for beavers in the Road Valley near where I live. And this is good because then you can go out and actually look at these places and say, well, is it good for beaver now? This is Josephine Creek. Josephine County was named after this miner's wife, Josephine, and it was heavily mined. They mined it to the basement, which means they took everything, all the sediment down all the way to the bedrock. So this creek has lots of water. It's an appropriate gradient. It would be a great place for beaver. It probably had beaver for thousands of years, but when I walked it, there was no soil left. There was literally no place for a beaver to den. And so this is kind of the important first step at looking at the landscape you're in and trying to assess, okay, where is it at when it comes to bringing beaver into the area? This is then another important is, where are the beavers? This is a local national monument, the national monument, and we ran these models. We saw, okay, there should be beavers throughout, and then we start looking, and then we're not finding beavers. So you're starting to just kind of understand where and why. Here's a spot that even to our eyes, there should be lots of beaver. There's lots of appropriate vegetation. There's lots of pools and woody debris, and you can see beavers move around occasionally because there's an occasional there, but why aren't they here? You start digging down a little bit deeper, and in this case, it might be because this area is very heavily grazed by cattle every summer, to the point where all of these shrubs are eaten back to nubs. And plants have a chemical defense. They pump themselves full of bitter phenolic compounds when they're getting overgrazed. And so even though to the naked eye this looks like really good beaver habitat, this section could be literally embittered. These plants could be so bitter from all the cattle grazing that there's nothing for beavers really left to eat. And the last part of the context is the people. This is really important because people have various ideas about the land and how it should be and how it has been. And one example I would give is the community of Nesquin, where I've been working on the Oregon coast. This is a group of folks who have gotten around to try to start planting beaver. This is Nesquin. You can see there's a flooded golf course. In the center of this photo is a wildlife refuge, and then kind of off to the side is a family who's lived there a long time, and they used to have a dairy, and beavers are now trying to move into that area, and the stream that their forefathers kept really constrained, the beavers are trying to reconnect all of that. But what that does is that floods the landscape that they've got other ideas about how to use. And so there's been beaver trapping there. Meanwhile, high up in the watershed, the municipal water supply folks really want to see beaver there because they're looking at less and less beaver or less and less water every year. And they're thinking, well, those dams would be pretty great. But they'll never get beaver up high in the watershed if there's a place where folks are trapping down low. Because if you think about beaver as territorial animals, they'll pick the next best territory when the teenagers are out looking for a new spot, right? And so if you've got a new spot that's really great territory and the young beavers move to it and then they get themselves trapped, that becomes a population sink. That's like a black hole in the beaver population. And so it's really important to find those and try to help address those spots, because otherwise you can see whole landscapes that will never see beavers back because of just a couple places where folks are on a treadmill of kind of reactive management. I would say when we decide to get our hand story, the most important thing is to help beavers stay, to really focus our energies on those sites where beavers have already chosen to live. This is Lyles' speech chart. He and I have been working for 5 years on his farm. He planted some willows on the sides of the creek and beavers showed up. He's been there for 5 generations. His family Conestoga wagon that the pioneer came over with is still in the barn, and but he had never seen beavers there because his family always farmed right to the edge of the creeks. And so when he planted a bunch of willows to start trying to filter some of the fertilizer running off of his fields, the beavers showed up and they started plugging all of his culverts. And the habitat that they're creating there is really wonderful. And those beaver, if they stay, are putting young beaver out into the landscape every year. But this could easily be one of those situations where you get a population sink and a black hole too. This again is that meadow. So I would say iteratively helping beavers where they are, the next step is to help them make a stand in those places where it's become too degraded. This area has really high velocities during the wintertime. That's part of what's made all this incision. And so beavers can't really build a set of dams that'll last there. So in this context, that's when people can come in and we can kind of build our own woody debris structures and kind of slow the water and settle it out first, enough to where that there's enough speed bumps in the system that beavers can step in and take over. And this is a shot of camas from that field. Like I said, was an important camas meadow. And then the last example I would give, I would say people like to move beavers around. We like to think, well, if there's beavers down in the city and we could put them up here in the boonies where they can't cause any harm, that would be great. I think that's kind of the last resort, because remember the treadmill that we're trying not to help facilitate. If you're taking problem beavers from someplace down in the lowlands, that's going to just be another spot that more families are going to move. So you're not actually going to solve the problem there. And then it's pretty traumatic for beavers to move them. That said, sometimes beavers are going to get killed for whatever reason, and it's nice to have places to put them. This is a spot where I don't think beavers could find on their own very well. This is Parsnip Lakes and the Cascades of Ski National Monument. And there's an endangered frog here, the red spotted frog or northern spotted frog, that is kind of on its way to potentially winking out into extinction. It's just kind of the most mature females left, and they haven't had any successful reproduction for 5 years in a row now because the beavers were trapped out of this pond. And when the beavers were trapped out, the cattails, I'll go back to that picture, the cattails started coming into the area because the beaver pond fell apart and it got more shallow. Well, when the cattails came into that area, they use a lot of oxygen over the course of the evening and night as they're decomposing under the water. And what happens to the frog eggs is they basically get starved for oxygen because of all that decomposition. The water's too shallow. And so for 5 years now, all the frog eggs have died, right? Without that beaver dam keeping this at a deep. So this would be a great spot to talk about. Okay, let's move some beaver in. And I guess I'll wrap up here. This is not as pretty a shot, but this was a very exciting thing. This is the creek I live on. And Some beavers came and tried to make a stand one year. I grew up swimming in this creek called Thompson Creek as a kid in the 90s. And every summer, I remember really dragging my feet as we crossed the cattle pasture, because you'd want to be really good and hot before you jumped in this creek. It was so deep and cold. And we'd poke at little fish or big dead fish, spawned out fish when they'd run in the wintertime. And my daughter and sons don't have that experience anymore. This creek started going dry in about 2005, and it's bone dry every summer now. That's a change that we've seen in my lifetime. There's no more fish coming up here. I tried to explain to my daughter what a crawdad was the other day, and she looked at me like I was crazy. Like, the creek had miniature lobsters in it. What are you talking about? So talk about shifting baselines just over the course of, the last 30 years. Beaver came and tried to make a stand in this creek, and I watched this dam over the course of the summertime. So they built this dam, and then the creek started to go dry, as it has been going dry, and it eventually went dry upstream of this dam, such that there was no water flowing into this dam anymore. But the dam was still full of water, and then downstream of the dam, it was still letting water out, right? Which was cool. It was a testament to how much it had recharged the local water table. And for probably 2 weeks, it was letting water out, but there was nothing on the surface coming in. Probably a subsurface flow, of course, but you couldn't see anything on the surface coming in. You could see water on the surface leaving. And then the water on the surface leaving dried up. And then for probably another 4 weeks, this was the only water in that entire area. And the beavers were keeping it all kind of held in there. And this was like a Serengeti watering hole for the local wildlife. Everything was here utilizing this pool. And after about 4 weeks, this pond dried up too. The beavers bailed into a local irrigation pond that has water artificially, and waited out the rest of the summer and left. But it really speaks to what's possible if we could have more than just one pond, right? That extra time that it buys the system. If there's another dam to catch that water below and there was more dams upstream, you could see how we could build back to a system where we have water year round, even though the snowpack has diminished. So there we go. That's my little spiel. Let's chat about beavers. I'd be happy to answer any questions you all have. Let me stop sharing this. I spend a lot of time helping folks with beaver conflicts and helping folks trying to entice beaver in. So any nerdy biology questions too, happy to.
So Jacob, I have a burning question I'm wondering about. Years ago, I saw a special on Nova about this. I kind of wonder if you were in it, but the question was, what about speakers playing water? Do you ever use that method? Speakers playing the sound of running water, and is that super effective in your experience?
Yeah, that was a good paper I remember reading, where people took little battery operated boom boxes and they played trickling water sounds on the edge of beaver wetlands. And they'd come back the next morning, there was literally half a ton of mud stacked up on top of this boom box, just shoved into every cranny, because the beavers were so triggered by the sound of trickling water. A lot of what I do to try to help culverts staying open is to try to diminish that sound of trickling, because the beavers seem to really cue off that sound, and that really seems to get them damming. So I would say, yeah, if you wanted them to dam, that would be interesting. But generally, I'm trying to keep the sound diminished. One thing that I have done, where I'm trying to see a beaver dam built. So say beavers are in an area and they're plugging a culvert right in its mouth. And it would be fine if they were there, but it would be great if they were plugging the culvert like 6 feet up from the mouth so that the culvert was still open. You can go in and you can build like your shoddy impression of a beaver dam so that there's enough trickle to where, and take out theirs in the culvert. So there's enough trickle to where when they show up that evening, they're embarrassed by your work. They're like, this is a disappointment of a dam, but I can fix it, and they'll improve upon what you did in the new location with the trickling, and they'll leave their old location alone. So that's often a really easy, just kind of like jujitsu right out of where a big conflict and move it a few feet upstream by stacking the cobbles up in the creek and giving that trickle and creating a human version of the beaver dam.
Thank you very much. I didn't know it worked in reverse. The corollary is also true. The opposite is also true.
Yeah. A lot of the techniques around like a pond leveler is a technique for trying to keep a beaver dam at a certain height. Say people built houses on a historic wetland and they can't let the beaver dam get too high anymore, or it floods houses. If you just notch a beaver dam, of course the beavers will come and fix that. The trickle's right there. And that's where they expect it to be. But if you can hide that leak out in their pond by running a pipe over the dam at the level you want, imagine like your bathtub drain, right? And then the intake to that pipe is hidden 40 feet out in their pond, and you build a cage around it so the beavers never swim close enough to feel that there's water leaving through their whiskers. And so then they'll obsess over here looking for the trickle, and meanwhile you've got this quiet leak over there. So that's often, I work with a lot of highway departments and road departments and folks that spend a lot of time dealing with beaver issues. And one of the ways I frame it is like, well, let's see if the monkeys can outsmart the rodents here, And one of the things that I try to help folks think about is let's diminish that sound of trickling, because that's what's drawing them in.
I was wondering, do you ever, a lot of the problems it seems to be is that civil engineers are not taught how to work with beavers. If there might be a way to get into academia to inject something, so that civil engineers can, because the truth is for many years with the Corps of Engineers leading the way, it was all about make that water move as fast as possible. And now they're starting to learn about, slow sink spread and all that. So I don't know exactly what they're being taught right now, but.
Yeah. This Monday, I actually traveled up to Portland, drove 5 hours to give a presentation to, what was it called? The Oregon Association of County Engineers and Surveyors. Okay. And this was like, it was like their professional conference. And I was like the one weird presentation about beavers, that was to break up the day. And my experience with that was that there isn't a lot of conversation at all happening. And what often happens when folks are developing flat land, they take these flat areas that have been farmed for 150, 250 years. And nobody remembers that the folks who settled that drained wetlands to facilitate all that flat, fertile land. And so then they come in and from like a engineering perspective, planning perspective, what I often see is they'll say, okay, well, there's a creek here. We'll do a restoration project. Maybe we'll even make it a mitigation bank so we can get some credits for it. And then we'll develop some houses and we'll put some stormwater treatment ponds and we'll put some infrastructure. And they do all of that at the same elevation.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they're shocked when the beavers move into their restoration project and reconnect the entire floodplain. And then they've got all this other infrastructure and all this other stuff built at the same elevation, and everyone's scratching their heads. And that's usually when I get called in, and it's like 6 years too late because they just built everything at the same elevation. So
that's what I'm talking about, is like for them to start kind of redoing how they approach to accommodate, natural processes like that.
Yeah. I don't know a good way in. I mean, yeah. I was at the talk and I walked away thinking, well, that was an attempt, but I don't think that's the way in to the course material. These are the professionals that are already out there doing it, and I feel like it has to be introduced even earlier, potentially.
Introduced by a civil engineer.
Yeah, that too. I was like the goofy biologist. Yeah,
like you get together and write a book with a civil engineer, a new text.
Right. You use their words.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Doug. Oh, you're on mute, Doug. We can't hear you.
There we go.
All right.
Okay, I really love this, and I think beavers are just amazing. I live in California. Is there any organized effort about beavers in California?
Yeah, the Occidental Society of Arts and Ecology is probably the best organized effort in California, and they're really starting to put together some really good work. So California, they we were talking about this a little bit at the start. When Joseph Grinnell, the famed naturalist, came through and was recording the conditions of sites, he came through California after the beaver trappers. And so he didn't record anything about beavers. And so then the state of California didn't think beavers were a native species. Up until like the last 10 years, they would push back and say beavers aren't native to California. So the Occidental Society of Arts and Ecology did a really in-depth review of native place names, and they pointed to like thousands of names that have beaver in them. They did archaeological work pointing to like old beaver dams. They had to do this incredible study just to persuade California that beavers were indeed native. And then of course, recently within this year, the governor of California, as part of their drought work, has said, we're going to have a program that helps facilitate beavers on the landscape. And so it's kind of made a lot of progress over the last decade. And one of the big things in California is the work around wildfire severity and beavers. And I think there's a lot of focus in California around, well, if we had more beaver dams, we could potentially see a drop in wildfire severity locally. Google was at the last beaver conference I was at. They said, I don't know, five employees, and they're working on a machine learning algorithm to identify beaver dams from space, kind of in the same interest of like, well, where there's beaver dams, there's less wildfire severity. So I think a lot of that drought and fire is actually starting to take place. Those conversations are happening in California.
Well, thanks. That's very helpful. Actually, the Occidental Center is 15 miles from where I live, so I'm going to go.
Nice. Yeah, go hit them up about beaver. Yeah. And I'll put my contact in the chat too for anyone who's interested. I would love if you wanted to reach out, if you have any other ideas. We've got a nonprofit called the Beaver Coalition where we're trying to attempt making some progress in this world.
That's great.
Yeah, Mary Jo.
Have you ever heard people say that beaver dams can cause the possible danger of flooding if they break? This is a rationale that's been put forward in my town in Massachusetts as a reason why beaver dams need to be destroyed. And recently beavers were killed in my town for that reason and other reasons.
Yeah, I've heard that a couple of times in various contexts. And I've heard the exact reverse too. It's kind of funny. You can find people making arguments every which direction. And it's true, sometimes beaver dams fail, but it's usually in a context where it's like the one dam trying to make a stand, and otherwise it's a pretty degraded system. So you have a lot of high velocity. So there's something to be said about like the strength in numbers to beaver dams. And literally beaver dams take root. So if they're in place for a couple of years, all those willow twigs start growing roots into the stream bank. And the context in which the beaver dam we see now is like the version of a beaver dam when it's kind of like the new settlement. Like it's not very rooted into the landscape. When a beaver dam's been in place for even 5 years, you can't even really see it. It's just this green amorphic part of the landscape because the whole thing's growing. It's all rooted. There's no way it could cave out, right? And so I've worked with folks, like if there's a beaver dam upstream of a culvert or something where people are really concerned, I've worked with folks to reinforce it. I mean, you can put steel posts into a beaver dam and really reinforce it. And then, the humans can pat themselves and feel better about it. Beaver dams are really strong as it is. So I usually recommend like a combination of steel posts so people feel better and living willow posts to kind of kickstart that, like, hey, let's root this into the landscape piece. But as far as the hydrograph, when city folks and municipalities really are concerned, especially when they've put a lot of impervious asphalt all over the place, and so then creeks get way flashier because this landscape is draining. There's a lot of concern around those huge swings and velocity, and beaver dams really help mitigate that. They're like these speed bumps that slow and spread in the context of the municipality. So I've actually seen a lot of cities going the other way, and they're like, we need more beaver dams in the system because we have such flashy systems. We need to be building in those speed bumps. City of Milwaukee has been looking at, for a number of years now, actually purchasing thousands of acres of their headwaters and doing beaver-based restoration all upstream, simply to kind of knock the peaks off that hydrograph, like to chill the water out before it hits the city, because it's been causing such big floods. And in Europe, that's a big thing with beaver dams too. It's like, well, if we got more beaver dams, we wouldn't have the city flooding. So yeah, I think local to the one dam, just there's ways to reinforce it for that 5-year duration where it's kind of susceptible, but also helping folks see like these things literally root into the landscape, and it's like the more of them, the better kind of situation. I don't know. Fear is a powerful thing for humans, and it's if they're afraid, they're going to go kill the beavers, and sometimes you can't get around that. But driving steel posts, often humans like that. It feels like we did something. It feels like it's going to be strong now. I'm relatively skeptical if it makes any difference whatsoever, because the dams are strong in themselves. But that's been my strategy.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Yeah. And, beavers will be back. So those that got killed and that dam that got ripped out, if it's good beaver habitat, they'll be back. So you'll have the opportunity to talk to folks again, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're pretty happy in the pond just above there. So
yeah. Any other questions? Still got a few minutes before the next session.
Yeah, what exactly qualifies as good beaver habitat? I mean, how do you find it? Because when I'm reading old stuff, and I'm in Texas.
Yeah.
And, I'm on like the eastern part of the Edwards Plateau that is mostly limestone, very shallow soils and all that. Yet beavers were reported to be throughout. We get flash floods. I mean, still there were beavers. Is there? And you mentioned at one point that the rains come through or something like that in the winter. I mean, would flash floods just blow out the dams and then they come back and rebuild, or what?
Yeah, in the desert flash flood arroyo kind of situation, I haven't spent a lot of time with beaver habitat in that situation. I was in the Southwest in Arizona and New Mexico recently, and looking at beaver wetlands there. And it is interesting because those cottonwood coppice stands, there's beavers that exist there. And I think it would have, back to that slowing and spreading, I think there's something there that we're like, if we could gaze back into the misty mists of time, what did those flash floods look like when there was beavers all across the landscape?
Okay, I see what you're saying. That
you know what I mean?
It, absolutely. Well, because I have a picture taken from about 1850 or so, and it shows the Comal River, which is north of San Antonio. And you know how everyone today, they want to look clean. And this is messy. It was messy. The river was messy. It was thick. It was vegetated. And in the middle, you can see the head of a beaver.
Oh, cool.
And it was messy. And if these flash floods were having the same kind of level of effect, all that debris would have been up in the trees, not all gathered around and forming out on the ground and that kind of thing, because every time that there is a flash flood now, it just wipes everything out.
Totally. And that chocolate milk color, that's all the soil leaving too. But if it was slow enough and there was enough diversity of tangled, complexity, and it gets slow enough, that all drops out of the water, and you actually have a stream, kind of coming up in elevation and spreading out even more. So that's the thing. The cool thing about a system that's moving a lot of sediment is that's a lot of soil that you can then use to build a creek back out of its incision, The hardest creeks to get out of their incision are when the soil is all gone and there's nothing feeding it. But yeah, that one's a really tricky one where people probably have to play a role in introducing the first level of complexity and roughness to the point where beavers can make a stand. Otherwise, they're going to get blown out over time. And that's where you get the Beaver Dam analogs, the low tech process-based restoration.
Beaver mimicry.
Yeah, exactly. But it's us coming in and kind of on scale, putting a lot of roughness in so we can slow it down enough to where the beavers can come back. Yeah. And your landscape needs the beavers back. So it's a worthwhile effort.
Down San Antonio, the San Antonio water system is actually 50% embracing beavers. So they do have a few beavers and they're working with them and to the best that they can. I'm like, no, you need to do better.
Nice. Yeah. It's a new thing for a lot of folks.
Just had a quick question.
Yeah.
So my family has property in the Mount Shasta area, Northern California. And, I think I've seen sign of beaver in the Shasta River, which flows through our property, but I'm not sure. Certainly haven't seen any in my lifetime, but what would be the process that I could go through to get involved with any local projects around that?
Yeah. So Shasta, who's your local watershed council? There's Sharna Gilmore is a name that's working in kind of the Scott River Valley area. And I'm not sure if that's too far south or if their kind of focus is up toward where you're at too. But I would suggest looping in. I put my email in the chat. I can kind of try to help you tune in with some local folks. On the context of rivers, like if it's a deep bodied river, often what you see is beaver are living in the bank, and they'll, like, if they don't have to build dams, they won't build dams. Like if they got lots of deep water and a big river, life is peachy. And in fact, they're kind of like people in that way. They like riverfront property. What a lot of times we see is there's enough places where landowners and beaver are overlapping on those riverfront properties, where like maybe somebody moves to a riverfront and they plant a bunch of Japanese maple or something else that doesn't have a long history with beaver, and then the beaver cut them down. And so then the people start trapping beaver. And that can create those population sinks, those black holes on a main stem river. And then if you've got that, the young beavers will never go into tributaries, into small streams, while there's a niche available on a main river. Main rivers are awesome. Like you got lots of food, you got deep water. That's awesome. And so the cool thing about having a main river through your area is it's like going to be high value beaver habitat, especially if there's willow or you can help facilitate willow there. The tricky thing is like, who's your neighbors? Back to that context of people, do you have a better beaver habitat nearby that's on some sort of trapping cycle? And if that's the case, that's usually why you won't see beavers in your area. You'll see the like occasional sign, but why aren't they showing up? It's usually there's a black hole somewhere in your landscape, and it's meeting that person and kind of chatting with them about, okay, well, how could we get off this treadmill so that your property becomes a territory and it pushes beaver out into the other properties?
Got it. Thank you.
Feel free to hit me up and I can try to help you find some folks in your area. You're pretty close to where I'm at, where that property is.
Okay.
All right. We have 1 minute to go scramble to the next sesssion. So I guess I'll let you all go. Thanks for tuning in. And yeah, hit me up if you've got any advice or want to get involved. All right. Thanks. Bye, everybody.